That is right. That is right, beautiful community. You can have a little Sunday chat. Might not have moderation today, so we're going to do comments on slow mode, which means you can't write more than 1 per 30 seconds. And you are very, very welcome. And I hope that you are having an okay Sunday, and I'm sending you lots of love. You can tell me important things like whether you're hearing me or whether you're seeing me. Looks like we're going to be an infinitesimal group of humans today. So that could mean we can engage with each other a little bit more. Let me know if you can see me and hear me. I don't know why we're such a small group. It could be that I've done something to the settings. Maybe only subscribers can. No, if only subscribers can write, that doesn't mean that others can't watch. So we might just be a small group anyway. I like scrolling to the top because of the tremendous appreciation I feel for people who leave me questions early. Let's have a look. Jasper Snell. Hey, Vlad. I was wondering, what are the differences that allow for public individuals to support Putin and Russia in the USA, but not in the UK? So we are very divided in the UK about Israel-Gaza, but we are not divided about Ukraine. We're quite lukewarm in our support for Ukraine, but we're not divided about it. Something like 80 to 90% of us take a pretty clear position of disfavoring the Kremlin and favoring Ukraine. So Ukraine doesn't get into our culture wars the way it does in the United States. So that's one thing. Another thing is Trump's own discourse, which is quite distinctive in the United States, and the fact that if you like, post-truth populism is on the rise in the UK, but the power of right exclusionary populism in the UK still hasn't caught up to some European countries and hasn't caught up to the US. I predict that it's going to be easier rather than harder over the next couple of years to say positive things about Putin in the UK, but so far it isn't. And the leader of what you would call the UK's post-truth populist faction, Reform, did make a somewhat Russia-sympathetic set of statements recently, Nigel Farage, and he got into trouble for it. So I accept your premise, and I think there's going to be several factors behind it. Having said this, I don't think even in the United States there are people who positively speak out for Putin. They speak along the lines of, oh, it's complex and there's truth on both sides. Jack, I've come here after watching the new Silicon Curtain episode. John on Silicon Curtain has just reached 100,000 subs. And I am 100% convinced in your video yesterday. Oh, so you're convinced that my impression of the person who couldn't tolerate alternative opinions, I did an impression of a person who couldn't tolerate alternative opinions in my chat video yesterday, I think. And it was really a sort of joke at the expense of somebody sitting in Vancouver sipping on a frappuccino and getting enormously exercised by what the Russian opposition said. And my impression was basically, that Barry, this frappuccino sipping citizen of Canada was getting exercised about something happening in reference to a country he'd never been to, and getting exercised by statements by people who have no power of any significance in Russia and have no power in the West at all. These Russian opposition, heroic Russian opposition folks who got released. And so I mocked the idea of going over the top and freaking out about the fact that they may say things that we might not agree with. And the reason I put that front and center is because of my concern about how much we moralize political disagreement and make it also a matter of identity. But I myself criticized these heroic people for being apolitical. And I spent 45 minutes, in fact, talking about how we don't want to be like them. So I myself was very critical of them, but I was also critical of the response to them. That's to say, I felt they were depoliticized, but the response to them was also depoliticized. Quite frankly, was often self-fascistized in the sense that there were people on Twitter with the message that they should be sent back and so on, or that they're peddling Kremlin messages, which they're obviously not. So I stick with my critique of depoliticization, but I don't welcome the sort of moralized identitarian nitpicking of different things they said as though it's the be-all and end-all of the world, of what it is that they said in that press conference. And I say that not to just pick on a bad way of being politically, but because I'm saying that way of being just infuses our whole politics. So I kind of used the depoliticized Russian opposition, our depoliticized reaction to them, as though as though it is what it is, which is to say an example to us of what not to be in our domestic political affairs. You're saying you felt John was guilty of that in his latest video. I haven't seen it, so I can't say. I did do an invitation to John to be careful with the excess of activism in perhaps my penultimate appearance on John's channel, and we did that in a very friendly and cooperative way. I was very grateful to him for platforming a criticism of him on his own channel, which I thought was appropriate all round. But yes, I might well think that there's a problem among many pro-Ukraine folks in the depoliticized nature of the response to the Russian opposition, because fundamentally, if you're Ukrainian, the only real question you have about these folks is, are they partial allies or not? That's it. Nobody's offering you, as I keep saying, to buy them as toys in the shop and keep them in your house, or to marry them, or to even vote for them. So that's an important point. And I do think that something like 70% of people in the pro-Ukraine circle are sliding off too far in away from a genuinely political response to these people. Les is saying, I hope you're well. Thank you so much. The Ukraine war may have a lot to do with the Spanish Civil War, where international force took a side, developed a tactic, and geared up before what became World War II. So, of course, there are going to be similarities between the Russo-Ukrainian War and the Spanish Civil War. But I think you're asking, could it be something that from which a much bigger war is derived? And the answer to that is probably not, but possible. Certainly, it is not our aspiration in the West to have an escalation of this conflict. And Putin's theory of victory isn't through a direct military confrontation with the West. His theory of victory over us, which is going a bit better than before, I'm afraid, in the last half year, is to bring it about that a Trump in the States, a Le Pen in France, a weak Russia sympathizing government in Germany a few years from now just does a deal with Putin and accommodates his project, sort of welcomes him back in without his destructive project changing. Either that or Putin challenging Article 5 in some way, and thereby exposing our weakness and incapacity to act in response. But even that, Putin's attack on Article 5, at least the way he sees that, in my view, isn't about bringing about a war. It's about doing something that makes us sit around and say, is this really enough? I mean, what is an Article 5 violation that we're going to respond to? And how are we going to respond to? So it wants to put us in this position whereby we're on the border about how we should respond, and that we end up not responding because of our weakness, and then, our soft power and our alliance structures are undermined. So on both sides, people are not aiming at a large-scale hot war. But of course, it's possible that it ends up being that. Piotr is saying, could you comment if it's okay as a form of deterrent to punish kids for the sins of their parents? For example, the children of Mr. Peskov, the spokesperson of Mr. Putin. So ethically, you are responsible for something that a blood relative of yours does, even if you're estranged from them, in the sense that you're going to feel connected to it, right? But that can never be enough for you to suffer any justified legal or political consequences, ever. So just the blood relation is never enough, right? But of course, if we are sanctioning a particular individual and that sanctioning is justified, it may be justified to sanction those connected with them. But that's not because of the blood relation. It's because they're benefiting from his power and money and so on, right? So just the very virtue of being related to somebody should never be something that is legally or politically punished. But so in virtue of that relationship, the answer is no. But in virtue of a situation where that relationship is then expressed in sort of various practical ways, where you're benefiting from the power and resources of a person we're trying to sanction, then that's a different story, absolutely. Hello, Richard. Hello, Russell. I'm just going to scroll down because I feel we've done the questions that were there at the beginning. Jack, it was my pleasure. Yeah, put it down to 30 seconds just because I thought Amalfitano wouldn't be hanging around with us. Sorry about that if that feels restricted. We're a smaller group. That could be nice too. Rachel is saying a lot of people in Germany in particular were sore that their government agreed to release murderers in exchange for political prisoners who didn't appear grateful enough in that moment. So they were actually very grateful. I don't think that's the way I would recommend to interpret it. They were enormously grateful. It's more that they felt this conflict whereby, of course, they had to come out because this was about saving their lives, really. Which is why it's so offensive that so many people in our pro-Ukraine circles have said send them back. I mean, these were not people who were sitting in a Scandinavian jail. These were people on course to be essentially politically assassinated by the regime in several cases, at least. So what somebody like Ilya Yashin was feeling was that he'd lost a lot of political legitimacy in virtue of being outside Russia. But at the same time is feeling enormously grateful for being released. So I didn't feel from his sort of rant that, oh my word, I don't even know what to do now that I'm here because I didn't want to be exchanged. I don't interpret from that there's a lack of gratitude. I think there's enormous gratitude. It's just that this is a boy who chose to go to jail. In the last instance, went to jail for telling the truth about Bucha on his YouTube channel. And, he was happy to put himself and put his life on the line. His close associate, Boris Nemtsov, lost his life in February 2015. So he's just really all in, and it's going to be hard for him to start working properly in the West. But the conflict you're gesturing at, Rachel, is absolutely right. There is no way to weigh this up without considerable loss. And as I very clumsily put it in my chat yesterday, you're really weighing up something like decency or some kind of civilizational values situation. You're saving people's lives versus security. And I think it would be dishonest to deny that there's a loss in terms of security that we accrue as we rescue these people. So, everywhere you choose, you lose is often true, and it's certainly true in this case. But I would argue that given that we had the possibility to, it was correct to get these people out, irrespective of what they think and what they say and what they're going to do. Happy Dogs saying thank you, helps me to understand what's going on with the war and the complicated interconnections. Thank you for being with me so much. No, not really. Collective West is saying it's a concern if the Russian opposition have a voice in the Harris administration. That could undermine support for Ukraine. Well, Yashin came out apparently today and said something that contradicts what he said, to some extent contradicts potentially what he said the day before, which is he called for a full immediate withdrawal of all Russian troops from Ukrainian territory. But in terms of a scenario where some of these Russian opposition politicians may push for peace more than we would like to, let's say more than I would recommend, it's not going to have any significant effect on Western policy. 98% of our struggles around insufficient support for Ukraine are ours. They're not going to be dramatically magnified by what people in the Russian opposition say, in my opinion. So I think that I would say put it like this: your worry is legitimate, but it's a very small issue. There's no chance that the Russian opposition could in any significant way inflect Western policy. Again is saying, Vlad, you've been saying a Trump victory is likely, but according to Alan Lichtman, the keys to the White House, Guy Harris is winning. Thoughts? So Alan Lichtman's theory can risk sounding like a theory when it isn't, because he is making a set of generalizations that are actually impossible to sustain if you take a serious view of what you can and cannot generalize about in the social sciences. So what he's really doing is giving a set of factors that make a difference in a particular historical slice of time. I think we're largely outside of that slice, which is to say that the arguable accuracy of his predictions up until this point don't necessarily apply anymore in the new post-2014 world with post-truth and populism and so on. Moreover, several of Alan's keys, he'd be very angry about me pushing this objection too far, but I would push it far, are vague. So there's two things. The keys are indeterminate, number one. Number two, the most likely explanation for why, although even that needs to be argued for, they seem to be successful for a period of time, is not that they are simply successful, but that they were a set of sort of shorthands that reasonably well worked predictively in a certain historical milieu. I mean, right, imagine you took his keys and tried to apply them to 16th century Europe, right? Um, well, let's pick a period with elections, any period with elections in human history, 19th century England, right? So obviously they require a particular cultural context to even be taken seriously. And I'm saying that to some extent that historical and cultural context has shifted. So I put an extremely low epistemic value around the idea that he's saying Harris is going to win. What I would say, though, is that we've moved from a situation where Biden had no realistic chance of winning, I mean, literally towards zero for all intents and purposes, to a situation where Trump's chances of winning have collapsed very significantly down to what I'd say they are now, which is probably about 70 or 80%. So we're still on course for a Trump victory, I'm afraid. So let's not get ahead of ourselves with all the hype. But we're genuinely in a situation now where Harris could win. And that just wasn't the case with Trump. So I do think that we're in a changed situation. Rachel is asking about Karamurza. He's a UK citizen. He's got a green card as well. General consensus is saying that Karamurza is an ungrateful swear word. I think that's a psychological misreading of him. And really misreading of yourself. I mean, any Western person, however much we might disagree with things they say, has got to see them as European politicians who've done heroic acts, right? We could criticize them too. And I, as you know, I don't do the trashy moralistic attacks on them. How dare you say this? How dare you say that? But my discussion of the apolitical nature of that panel that they did together, while being deeply empathetic to the fact that they have come out of not just jail, but jail where they were on course to be politically assassinated, right? I'm empathetic to that. I've spent time in my life with people who have been in jail as political prisoners, who have been tortured as political prisoners. I haven't been, but my extraordinary health journey very much allows me to empathize with people who have gone through really big stuff. So I absolutely feel what they've been through. But at the same time, they are politicians or they're political actors, and we are entitled to responsibly express criticism of them, at least in our case, as a way of teaching ourselves some lessons about depoliticization, which is something I ascribe to them and is something that I suggest we want to avoid. T is saying, is the exchange somehow a minimization of the confrontation between Russia and the United States? No, it isn't. I don't see it having any connection with anything, with one exception. The exception being that it is Putin potentially gesturing about his own negotiability, but as I warn, Putin gesturing at negotiability doesn't mean he wants negotiations, and Putin wanting negotiations, even if he wanted negotiations, doesn't mean he wants lasting peace. Does the question of the struggle between Western democracies and the global South and the undemocratic axis supersede the questions of Russia versus Ukraine, or is it the same question? So I would not overstate that struggle beyond a certain point. Yes, it's clear that authoritarian regimes are trying to undermine our democracies. There is no doubt about that. And we speak less about how the Chinese are doing it, more about how the Russians are doing it. They're both doing it. At the same time, the world, the so-called global South, which is an unfair generalization, is interconnected via a series of positions of both animosity and cooperation in different respects, right? It's this old story I talk about the world being full of friends and enemies in certain respects. So this is complex, right? And we ourselves in the West, that's also one of the sort of ironies of having a go at these Russian oppositional politicians. We ourselves are massively cooperating with Russia in the West. We're engaged in considerable trade relationships with Russia still. Just the latest example I saw today was somebody sharing a piece claiming that Lithuanian businesses had done trade with Russia in materials that could be converted for military purposes to the value of 130 million in between 2022 and 2023. So we are, even in the West, still doing a lot to prop Russia up. So we're in this world of enemies and allies in certain respects. The Chinese and India are enemies in certain respects, but cooperate in others. So we're engaged in this strange carousel. Which is why I think that there's a risk of kitsch simplification if we simply line ourselves up against the authoritarian countries and say, that's us, that's them. That kind of formulation has value, but without nuance, it risks taking us to Hollywood rather than into real history. Let's have a look. Hey, Vlad, can you comment on the perception of Western hypocrisy in the global South? Well, toward Ukraine vis-a-vis Israel. So that perception of hypocrisy is legitimate. It doesn't mean that we also can't have a go at some so-called members of the global South. And we can say, look, how do you expect us to take your anti-colonial fights seriously and your anti-colonial history seriously if you are taking the most egregious colonizer in the world today, Russia, and relating to them as they were some kind of anti-colonial challenge to US hegemony? We are entitled to call out that BS. At the same time, the perception of hypocrisy is tricky. And I'm afraid that what we have seen be done in Gaza by Israel has undermined support for Ukraine and has undermined not just the West's moral credibility in its backing for Ukraine, but has also undermined support for Ukraine among Western citizens. I mean, 90% of Brits in the country that I'm a citizen of are very sympathetic to Ukraine. If you look at polls in the UK toward Israel Gaza, then there's considerable sympathy for Israelis. There's more sympathy for Palestinians. There's very little sympathy for Hamas. But there's a preponderant sense that what has happened there is, to put it mildly, grossly disproportionate. And it's genuinely difficult. And so this sense of hypocrisy is very palpable outside of the West, as you rightly point out, but it's also palpable in the West. Most citizens of my country, Britain, can't look at Ukraine in the same way. They can't look at um, the Ukrainian capital being bombarded without pointing out that the pictures that coming out of Gaza are much worse. There is one qualifier I would add here, and that is that most of the time when Ukraine is in the news, we're getting pictures from the capital rather than pictures of the most destroyed cities or the cities that are on the other side, right, under Russian occupation. So I think that's also a factor, because there really are parts of Ukraine that look a bit like Gaza. So that we need to admit that too. But I think it's really difficult, and it also has another effect, not really anything to do directly with Ukraine, but it just undermines trust in Western institutions, because our institutions are telling us, "Oh my word, there's a moral emergency there in Ukraine," but then we are, certainly in the case of the United States, driving a policy that has consequences that look similar to what we're supposedly outraged about on the ground in Ukraine. And that really is very corrosive for citizens. Citizens begin to feel, well, you're just gaslighting me. You're just gaslighting me. And as somebody who's passionate about democracy, um, I'm I'm keen on even separating this issue from practical consequence, right? Because there's not much that Britain can do, for example. But just at the level of protecting institutions, even if you are relatively powerless, it's important not to bias your population too much, by denying the reality of what's on the ground in Gaza. So even if you are not thinking about Palestinians, even if you're not thinking about the Middle East, even if you're not thinking about Ukraine, if you're just thinking about your own institutions being trusted by your citizens, it's just a bad idea to gaslight your citizens. And that's, as somebody who is a sort of, you know, a hyperactive defender of democratic ritual, I'm very worried about that too, and I palpably feel people being gaslit. And I actually think most people in this community feel gaslit by the U.S. government if they're U.S. citizens, or by the British government too, when you're told that one thing is okay, but the other thing is really not, and you're trying to square this. Jack is saying Putin seems to be trying to politically defeat Ukraine. Brilliant point. Brilliant point. In the last year, at least, the U.S. In the U.S., Ukraine has been politically weak, and how likely is? Yeah. So when we talk about Putin wanting to defeat us by encouraging us to defeat ourselves in terms of our democracies at home, a dramatic version of that truth is a truth about Ukraine too. He's not thinking about conquering Ukraine territorially anymore, although he'd take that if they were offered to him. He is thinking about making Ukraine ungovernable, right? And I've talked many times to you about ungovernability being Putin's aspiration for us in the West. But Putin wants to make Ukraine ungovernable. And this is what I'd go with quite far, actually. I'd say that even a lot of the military analysis you're watching, right, sometimes misses out the political dimension, that some of what the Kremlin does militarily, bad things they do to Ukraine, is aimed not at achieving military objectives, but at creating political instability in Ukraine. So they want to make the Ukrainian government's dialogue with its citizenry harder than it is today, and it's already hard. And they think that that's a good strategy over the next year or two for them to destabilize the country. So it's very much a project of political destabilization that Putin has in mind now when he thinks about how to get his way in Ukraine. We've got to be very serious about that. When there's attacks on civilian infrastructure, a lot of the logic is, can I bring it about that Ukraine becomes ungovernable? Can I put Zelensky in a position where he is at a rift with his own people? That is very central to Putin's thinking. I think you're right to emphasize that. University of Science is saying thank you from Philadelphia. My pleasure. I've never been to Philadelphia, except once coming through the airport, I think. Let's have a look at where we are. Dimitri is saying, hi, Vlad. I don't know, that wasn't your focus. I know that wasn't your focus, but what do you make of this presser as Russian expat? I do not want to be beside myself. I want to do something constructive. How to facilitate politicization? Oh, my word. So I said that I didn't have any emotions about the press because I don't have any civic Russian emotions because I'm a Western citizen and haven't lived in the Soviet Union since 1990. But empathizing with how I'd feel if I were a Russian citizen, I said I'd be absolutely beside myself, despite being so loving of these people's extraordinary commitment and courage. But I'd be beside myself about the lack of politics, how to tackle it. I think that a starting point is to ban the phrase "we want to live like the civilized world," so that your conversations about a future Russia become concrete, right? And you just cut this stuff out about living like the civilized world, because the question that immediately arises: is the civilized world living well in the first place? Isn't it in democratic decline? Even if the civilized world is living well, is it stuff importable? Look at the disaster we had importing stuff in 1990, you'd say as a Russian. And three, don't bullshit me about the civilized world in general. Be concrete. So this is a big problem for how Ukrainians speak. It's a big problem for how Russian opposition speak about the future of their country. We want to be like the civilized world. That's not a way to be. There is no such thing. There is one particular policy dimension, transport infrastructure, and you say, this particular European country is doing it in a way we can model and borrow. These other European countries are doing it in a way that is bad. Those other European countries are doing it in a way that is good, but is not applicable to us. And here is why we're going to take that and try to borrow it. That is a much more concrete conversation, first. Second, you need to begin doing what I began to do in that fictional conversation I had on the chat channel recently about, how you would begin telling these Russian oppositionals to politicize themselves. I said, you've got to start speaking to the first problem of politics, which is order, security, bringing it about that humans don't go around trying to take each other out. The first Hobbesian problem of politics. So as soon as you put that politically front and center, and it's really front and center. I mean, Russia had a mutiny over a year ago. So it's a serious issue. So you put it front and center by having a message that is directed to the security services, a message that is directed to the military with a program, a blueprint for the future of these agencies and of these elements of the state under the kind of country that you want to see in the future as a Russian opposition person. So you gotta have a message for the Russian army, of course. And you've got to say, well, look, you're being destroyed morally and physically by being taken into Ukraine. And you've also got to start with patriotism. And you've got to start by reassuring Russians about how you're going to provide their security. Because if you start doing fluffy stuff like NATO is a friendly alliance and the West is cuddly, and as long as we overcome our imperial mania, no one wants to hurt us, literally nobody will listen to you except 10% of the population. So you've got to get politically serious and have security policy, speak to the various institutions of state. So that's just the beginning of that conversation. And then you have leadership, which is lacking at the moment. It was arguably there with Mr. Navalny. And then you've got to have a future vision for the country, which is not that hard. It actually starts with a 10-point charter of how you want the country to look at, but it's got to speak to everybody. You can't say we want to be a normal country. That, I'd even go further here, is itself a form of imperialism. Because one of the paths out for Russians out of an imperialist psychology is to stop talking about the civilized West and actually start talking about their own country in a less infantilized and in a more political way. So there is actually something imperialist about this innocent claim that you might often hear on a lot of the Russian opposition channels: we want to live like normal Westerners. Not because that's in itself an imperialist point, but because it is an avoidance of political thought that is still structured by the shadow of various imperialist stuff that you're trying to get away from. But you don't get away from it via depoliticization. Right? You have to give real politics. And I do think Ukraine itself, you could argue, is buying into imperialist discourse too, to some extent, by going on about all of this civilized world stuff. And so that's a paradoxical way in which the discourse of the victim of imperialism is still structured by its association with the imperialism of which it is a victim. So you absolutely have to get rid of that civilized world stuff. So that's the beginning. Stasis is saying Putin and his allies are making a case that Western NGOs are a major threat to their regime stability. What does a counter-argument look like? Well, a counter-argument looks like the basic claim that we have a plurality of institutions and organizations in democracy. What Mr. Putin is doing with this position is really saying that any domestic opposition or anything that is at an organizational level going to be critical of his regime must be a weapon of US interference in Russia's domestic affairs. So that's why he is incapable of seeing any independent institutional life, any independent institutional organizational life in his country as anything other than us interfering in Russia's domestic affairs and trying to undermine his regime. This is not an anti-slurping measure. This came because I did a fast mimicking diet for a few days. But you're right, it is interestingly an anti-slurping measure, as ridiculous as that thing looks. Collective West is right. Yes, Putin conflates opposition with enemy. Not with traitor. A traitor really is for Putin somebody who was on his side and then left. True Stefko is saying there's a real problem with the global south, together with Putin recognizing Maduro's unelected government. Look, There are some strong arguments we can make about countries in the so-called global south needing to wake up, but there's also a lot we need to recognize about how the global arrangements are not working for certain countries, and they feel resentful about that, and also how we in the West have a history of not standing by our own values and promises. So it's complex. And generally, the international system is reaching a crisis, reached a crisis of legitimacy, which is why you have a European Union in decline and the United States in retreat. So it's not like we've got an international system with legitimacy and bad actors undermining it. The bad actors are so uh, present at the moment because the international system is in meltdown. Dorgash is saying, could Russia ever exist as a dictatorship that is benevolent towards Europe in a sustained capacity? So unlikely. But is it possible that Putin around 2015 didn't take, or around 2010 or 2012, didn't take his missionary turn and develop this mystical vision of needing to thrust Russia from the back row of nations to the front row of nations to overwhelm the West? Yeah, it's possible. A lot of that is just Putin's individual biography. However, the regime's security reason for war, even without this mysticism, may well have been there. Because a tyrannical regime like Putin's, even without its mystical visions of history, which it does have, but even without these visions, an independent Ukraine on the border of a dictatorial Russia would have always bothered dictatorial Russia. So I would say that they could have been less apocalyptic, they could have been less mystically minded, they could have been less self-immolating, they could have been less reminiscent of various kinds of theistic fundamentalism, but they still, if they were a dictatorship, would have had a problem with democratic independent countries on their border. So the answer is it didn't have to be quite so sick, this manifestation coming out of the Kremlin, but even if it weren't so sick, it would have been a problem. Victor is saying, good evening, Mr. Vlad. Good evening, Mr. Victor. You have talked about credible political alternatives as a prerequisite for Russians to challenge their government. Yes, so I say that. I think I even wrote that on Twitter today when there was some kind of a discussion about, you know, why not a call to arms for the Russian population? And I said there are three things need to be in place. There needs to be a crack in the regime. There needs to be um, a an opposition capable of politicizing, number two. And number three, there needs to be an opposition that can speak to much of the country and offer an alternative vision, ideally articulated by a leader. So these three are what I would call the ingredients of a perceptible, actionable alternative. And all three are missing at the moment. So let's go back to Victor's question. What was it in 1991 that gave the courage? The Times? Was it Gorbachev? So there is a video on the main channel, right? Not here, about Gorbachev with my views about it. I do think that Russia had roughly 4 democratic opportunities in the last 150 years. A small democratic opportunity was in the transition from Yeltsin to Putin, although things were already looking dire then. A bigger democratic opportunity was 1991, the collapse of the Soviet Union. The biggest democratic opportunity were the 1910s. And another important democratic opportunity was, of course, the assassination of Alex II in the early 1880s. So I do think that things could have gone better and the opportunity in 1991 could have been taken, but it wasn't. So your question could really have two parts. What created the opportunity and why was the opportunity in the end not taken? What created the opportunity, I do think, is a combination of the fact that the Soviet Union was unsustainable without profound acceleration of repression, which Gorbachev was not happy to do. I mean, Gorbachev's position was, if this is going to take violence, I'm not going to keep this thing together. There's a lot that Gorbachev missed. In many ways, his dream of creating a kind of European Union on the ex-Soviet space was always a fantasy. He underestimated the power of nationalist sentiment on the Soviet space. But I do think that he remains an extraordinary positive actor for all the downsides. There were downsides, plenty of downsides, which I also mentioned in that video. I do think that without Gorbachev, that opportunity wouldn't have come until a bit later. And then the question arises, why was it missed? And part of the answer about why it was missed is that there was a practically motivated, but also an ideologically motivated avoidance of taking seriously the importance of political institutions, just focusing on economic policy. The idea that if you get certain economic things right, get them going, the politics will follow. That was never going to be the case. I mean, that's not an answer to you, but that's just an infinitesimal gesture in the direction of an answer. Is benevolent dictatorship an oxymoron? I think that it's possible, and this is one of the fantasies that we in the West have often sort of been under the spell of, wrongly. It's often the case that a malign order is better than the alternative, which is an anarchy. You could argue how far that was true in Iraq, right? So it's absolutely not the case that just because you nudge and overturn some kind of dictatorship that is particularly ghastly, that the chaos that will ensue is going to be better. One of the greatest human problems is tyranny, but arguably an even greater human problem is chaos and anarchy. So it depends. Now, if you're asking me, Rachel, could there be a legitimate government, a government that I'd regard as being deeply legitimate in the modern world in 2024, that was a dictatorship? My answer would be no. Because you'd then have to think about humans in that regime. You'd have to think about their desires, their values, and their projects. And as soon as you took a conversation about their values, their desires, their projects far enough, you couldn't reconcile it with them feeling really okay about having a dictatorship for a government. But that's a long story, which I obviously can't successfully tell now. David Chiruti. How should we support Russian friends, colleagues who oppose Putin and support Ukraine? I try to limit conversations of these subjects to in-person or Zoom so as not to out them in chat messages. So are you talking about people in Russia? Obviously, there's no such issue in the West. The Russians can say whatever the hell they want. Russians in Russia is hard. I must say that every time I see some kind of vox pop from Russia, I really cringe. I really cringe. Because you're effectively endangering people of going to jail. So I think that at the moment, the way the regime deals with people who say anti-regime things is still pointillistic. 999 out of 1,000 will get away with it, but it's going to become a bit more general, right? There's going to be more dots, more people are going to get picked up, and also you don't know how it's going to work retrospectively, right? You could say something in 2024 and be in the camps in 2027 for it. So I'd be extremely conservative about encouraging Russians to engage in public unless they are absolutely conscious that that's what they want to do and they're adult and fully aware of the risks. But what I wouldn't be part of is some kind of situation where Russians are sort of floating into that space without having thought intentionally about whether they really want to do it or not. Because even if you get a small sentence, your bank account could be frozen, you could be prevented from traveling, you could lose employment. So it's got to be intentional. That's my answer. And when it's not intentional, you've got to be very careful about facilitating any sort of public appearances. President Reagan is saying Trump is choking and Kamala is launching. What will Vlad the toilet thief do? Vlad the toilet thief still supports Trump, in my view, on balance, but isn't freaked out about a Kamala Harris presidency. He thinks it'll be a weak presidency that won't stand up to Russia effectively and won't support Ukraine enough. So he's okay either way, but he prefers Trump. And I've explained in several of my recent videos, just don't want to bore you by just being a broken record all the time, how I think his support for Trump works. I think roughly it's sort of clear enough, but not triumphant. But again, Trump flailing, which he has been, has collapsed him from effectively already being the winner of the next election to being a favorite. So Trump's collapse has only taken him down to being favored to win the presidential election. We've got to be realistic about that. So Kamala's rise is real. Trump's flailing is real. Chi, thank you for being first-time commentator coming out from the lurker sphere. Yeah, so we've got to be realistic that Kamala's rise, Trump's absolutely flailing antics, his disaster that he's had with J.D. Vance being a very poor VP candidate, all of that's undermining Trump. But for Trump to lose, he needs to keep on flailing. And there's really not a likelihood that he will do that. And Kamala Harris also needs to respond to many moments of challenge and pressure well. So it's still much more in Trump's hands than in hers, despite the massive rebalancing that's happened. Lucas is saying who would be best VP pick. I have a principle rather than an answer to that. And that is that it has to be a courageous and a proactive rather than a defensive pick. I'm going to leave it to US politics to sort itself out on that. But it needs to be a brave pick that pushes the bow out rather than the pick that tries to plug holes and be defensive. So that's what I'd say. If it is to be Shapiro, then I am worried about some of his mannerisms the way I've been worried about Kamala's mannerisms. He is too much presenting himself like a derivative of Obama, and he needs to adjust that a bit. Waltz has been on fire in the media, Rachel, right? But that might not be the pick. But my principle, you see, it's unethical for me to start lecturing too much about this, but I can just tell you as a principle, this applies to all Western democracies. When in doubt, and when you're a little bit behind, be bold rather than conservative. Be bold rather than defensive. And I think there may even be a special way in the United States in which that's even truer, whereby Democrats do better when they're bold and do worse when they're conservative. Daniel is saying, you said that US institutions were very resilient despite the toxic tensions in US democracy. How do US institutions differ from other Western democracies? Well, the difference is basically that you take a piece of paper and you map onto it the country's political institutions that have a capacity to check each other. So you're talking about questions like how many political chambers are there? You're talking about what levels of centralized and progressively localized institutions are there that can all check each other. And basically, the more dense that web is of institutional complexity, the harder it is to do one thing to break the whole picture. So, one of the reasons Israelis were so worried in the last couple of years about the attack on the judiciary by their government is that they are more simple institutionally and it's easier to break their democracy. So you're looking at institutional complexity and a sort of a web of institutions that make it hard to break the whole thing in a couple of moves. So the more complex a democracy is institutionally, the more it requires a complex, elite, sustained project to go bit by bit by bit by bit by bit by bit and start asphyxiating it. And the United States is the most toxic of the Western democracies, but it is also as institutionally resilient as any other. Mute, you're talking about the lack of technological progress in Russia within a few years, within a decade. Yeah, absolutely. They're going to feel that, even though their isolation is still pretty limited. Collective West is saying it's also helpful if democracies have past models of crisis which they have transcended. And that's important because it always teaches us, right, that democracy isn't just something that just evaporates as soon as it hits crisis. No, I don't include the Baltics when I talk about the post-Soviet space, because I really see the Baltics as now being behind a different kind of fence. When I talk about that space, I primarily mean Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. But I don't mean the Baltic states. I regard the Baltic states as being on the western side. Oh, Alexei is asking me about about Arestovich. It's hard for me to comment because Arestovich has clearly traveled a long distance in his position and his public statements in the last few months in particular. So it's hard for me to judge, I'm afraid, because I haven't listened to him for a long period of time, for a sustained period, like an hour or two in the last few months. But clearly he has drifted quite a long way. What I would say, Arestovich aside, is that Ukraine does better if its public discourse is broader and allows for more contrarian voices, and it does less well if its discourse is tight. Past cases of crisis is one issue, but there's also the issue of people forgetting these crises and not learning from them. Great point. I think that certainly institutions can learn from past crises and elites can learn from past crises, even if citizens are sleepwalking. I do think that there's a big problem with Western citizens sleepwalking. I think there's a problem with citizens trending toward populist politics being destructive of their democratic institutions, and there is a risk of us guys sleepwalking and just denying reality around us and being ineffective citizens. So I do think that a lot of what I'm seeing out there does look to me like a picture of supposedly well-meaning democratic citizens trying to save their democracy, but often obliviously doing the opposite. Time trader, Vlad, what would you say to the argument that what the Ukrainian government is doing to its own men is worse than what the Putinist government doing to it? Well, I do think that it's the case that Ukraine is in an existential war, and the Russian population isn't experiencing this as an existential war, with the exception of a small slither of it. So that's one distinction. But Ukraine's an innocent victim in this war, and Putin is um, engaging in an aggressive, maniacally imperial project from which um, Ukraine needs to defend itself. And there's plenty we can say that's critical about Ukrainian politics, plenty we can say that's critical about the Ukrainian military, plenty we can say that's critical about the Ukrainian government, about corruption in Ukraine. But if you're talking about sheer levels of ethics and political irresponsibility, there's just no contest, of course. What Putin is doing to his soldiers is absolutely egregious because he is engaging in a needless and very destructive war that isn't just going to be terrible for Ukraine, it's going to be terrible, it's going to end very badly for Russia. And he is pushing depoliticized members of his society from disadvantaged areas typically um, into a needless spree of taking of life and giving up one's life. So there's no contest. It's the pinnacle of gross political irresponsibility, what Putin is doing. There's nothing comparable on the Ukrainian side. Matt Potter is saying, do you think that because Navalny was part of the exchange, it contributed to his political assassination. Putin, in my view, was never going to allow Navalny to go to the West. And again, what we've witnessed with this exchange seems to demonstrate pretty clearly that the taking of Mr. Navalny's life was an intentional decision by Putin, um, so that he could get back Mr. Krasikov, but now without Navalny. So, as unlovely as Putin is, his analysis of who to not let out and who to let out is fairly accurate. His judgment is really good. His judgment is correct that Navalny would have been an existential threat to him in the West. His judgment is probably correct that Mr. Karamurza and Ilya Yashin and a few others are not an existential threat to him. So we're dealing with a deluded tyrant who is still very, very hyper competent politically. But what the exchange shows is that, yes, Putin was able to go there perhaps with Navalny and play along until he had to make the call that obviously it was always going to make, that Navalny couldn't be part of it. Zonko. Can you explain why there appears to be very little crossover between passions about Palestinian cause and passion about Ukrainian sovereignty? I think there is a lot of overlap, but there are different reasons for why there isn't an overlap. I think the left has roughly dropped the ball. The Western left has roughly dropped the ball on Ukraine. They've been behind the Palestinian cause, but they've dropped the ball on Ukraine. That's one factor. Another factor is that we can be praiseworthy of the West's intervention in Ukraine, even though we can criticize it for not being sufficient. But it's the West screwing things up, particularly the United States in its complicity with Israel's policy. I think another factor is that there's very little sympathy in Ukraine and in among the Russian opposition for the Palestinian cause. And so a lot of Westerners take cue from this. There's very high degree of racism in Russia and in Ukraine. The racism is worse in Russia toward the Palestinians, but it's bad in Ukraine too. Less bad, but bad. And so both among the Russian opposition and in Ukraine, there's a tendency for kind of just incapacity to process what's happened on territory of Gaza. And then Western people take the lead from that. So these are some of the reasons, but at the same time, I'd say that there's also a lot of overlap. I mean, as you know, I made about 7, 8, 10 videos about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in late 2023, something that I know quite a bit about. I've lived in Israel, of course, for a few years. So this is just a two cents of an answer, and it would be better to have a little bit more interconnection between the two issues. But here's what I'd say: humans are complex, and if you could get humans to get it right on one issue, that's better than none. So I'm not one of those people who says, "Oh, you haven't got it right on two issues, so you've only got it right on one, so go away." I'm somebody who welcomes getting it right on one, really. And also, don't forget, there's a lot of people who we've just talked about people who support Ukraine but don't give a hoot about the situation in Gaza. There's a lot of people the other way around who absolutely give a hoot about Gaza, but don't have any sympathy for Ukraine. So it also works that way around. Again, obviously, having mentioned Israel, Palestine, Gaza know that the community's capacity to engage in constructive dialogue over this is low, so don't push it, please. And I promise I will return us again to that topic. Lucas is saying, what do you think about the UK riots? So it's premature to comment because one of the things we need to see is how organic versus how orchestrated they were. And we need to see what campaigns of orchestration on social media there were. And so we need a few more days to get absolutely to the bottom of this. One point. Another point is that the leader of the populists in the UK, Nigel Farage, disgraced himself again by dramatically demonstrating his credentials as a political entrepreneur as a post-truth populist. He was a political entrepreneur by parasitizing on lawlessness. And he is a post-truth populist by, and I watched his recent statement just before coming on and speaking with you, in which he was saying, yes, and yes, and yes, and yes, but the post-truth going that way to one side of the mouth, going this way to the other side of the mouth. And what he was saying basically was, let's be calm and reasonable and collected, one sentence. The next sentence, hinting at violence to come. So the irresponsible disgrace and entrepreneurial opportunist Farage has classified him himself even more definitively in the post-truth thing. We need to take seriously that when citizens are pissed, that we understand how many there are. So it's politically correct to go around saying it's an infinitesimal minority when it's perhaps more than that. So we need to gain clarity about that. And we certainly need to be clear about not accommodating the connection to rioting of concerns that citizens have, which may or may not be legitimate. But if we disconnect these concerns from the rioting, we still need to go out and take these concerns seriously, like people's concerns over immigration and so on. One of the biggest issues with Nigel Farage disgracing himself is this question that I've got a few emails about, which is, what should the media do with somebody like him who is lying 700 times a week instead of 7, and who is post-truthing, saying the sky is yellow, but the sky is blue. The sky is yellow. It's very, very yellow, but some people say it's blue. But it's really yellow, but also maybe it's blue. And the problem is that we institutionally do not have journalistic answers to these problems. We journalists know how to deal with a liar who lies 7 times per week. They don't know how to deal with a liar who lies 707. And a national broadcast like the BBC has the responsibility to platform a major politician like Farage. So saying he shouldn't be platformed isn't an answer. But how is he to be challenged if he is platformed? That requires institutional answers and can't be left to the individual journalist's judgment. This is difficult. And the reason it can't be left to the individual journalist's judgment is that if the journalist simply tried to just correct Farage every time he lied, then the 10-minute interview would be 8 minutes of corrections and 2 minutes of him speaking. So that wouldn't work. So how do you do it? And it has to be institutionally driven, this principle. These principles need to be developed, and institutions are too scared to develop them. They can consult me, I can tell them what to do. Phillips is saying, is there a chance of ethnic minority uprisings in Russia, Buryats, Tatars, Kalmykians, Cherkessians, and so on? So there is a video in the main channel called Will Russia Break Up?, which is my statement on this issue, whereby I am taking quite an interesting line, I think. I am saying that all the conventional arguments for Russia breaking up are weak, and I challenge them. But then I say that Russia still has a big risk of breaking up despite these arguments being weak, despite these arguments, not because of them. And I think one of these things, one of these organizations that I'm somewhat mocking of, Free Russia, blah, blah, blah. Some child who runs their Twitter tried to take a pop at me on Twitter. So I might actually have a discussion of that, just as a curious point about how to do real politics and not do cheap identity politics moves. But so the conventional story that you often hear break Russia up is backed up by reasons that are bogus. Number one. Number two, despite that, the chances of Russia breaking up remain high, right? High as in not 1%, much higher than 1%. Close, perhaps in the double digits at least. And three, Russia breaking up is a real prospect that should be taken seriously, for which the West should prepare, but which would be a disaster more often than being benign. And I don't mean just a disaster for Russia, disaster for the West and for Ukraine. Mass refugee flows, mass wars, civil wars, and so on. But you're not asking me necessarily about that. You're saying, could there be more ethnic minority uprisings? And the answer to that is not could, but there definitely will be more, 100%. The answer, though, is that these might not be existential or aimed at, secession. And still, if you ask most ethnic minorities on the doorstep today, they don't want secession today. Could that change, right? But will there be protest in ethnic regions? Without doubt, there's going to be more. So what has to happen to reach such circumstances? Nothing. It's already happening. It'll be happening more. What circumstances need to obtain to make these existential for the structural integrity of the country? Well, then a lot. Then you need certain truths to obtain about local elites. Then you need certain truths to obtain perhaps about the ethnic composition of the ethnic regions, which is a lot more ethnically Russian than most people assume who don't know. There's a lot of sort of difficult things there. But while I dismiss the kitschy everyday Twitter activist arguments about Russia breaking up, I'd take the chances of Russia breaking up very seriously indeed. But I'd put that in a more pessimistic rather than optimistic light. It won't be a free flourishment of democracies. It would be a human catastrophe, more likely. Zonko, has multiculturalism failed in the UK? No, but certainly the majority in Britain is a bit alienated from the mass immigration politics of the Labour and the Conservative parties. There is a gap and a big opportunity for irresponsible politics to come in and take advantage of it. But just one bit of context. When you're seeing images online, they're looking absolutely horrendous, by the way, don't allow your mind, because when we look at an image, we just generalize it to neighboring 100 square kilometers. So let's be clear, apart from the riots today, crime is not out of control in the UK. It's an issue. It's not out of control. I don't go out that much because of my health physical limitations I have around sort of physical movement, but I feel safe in London, on the streets of London, very safe. So we also got to keep a keep a perspective here. There's plenty of American cities that are way more dangerous than London. James is saying occupation anywhere is a crime. General consensus says Trump talked to a group of black journalists and refused to answer a single question, instead spewed lies and conspiracies. So Trump had a bad day at that event, that's right. What he wanted to do, he didn't mean to have a good day there. He did mean to go there and fight and say, you're all a disgrace, big disgrace, tremendous disgrace. But he meant to say that compellingly and convincingly. Instead, he was mocked by the audience. He didn't manage to speak convincingly, even to his own demographic. So he flopped that event. Even though he didn't go there to ingratiate himself, he went there to fight and to score points that could then be put into little clips online. But he had a bad day. He would have been pissed off about it, which is part of his flailing dynamic recently. But he needs to flail for weeks and weeks to lose, however. Rachel has mentioned Casey Michel. Yes, I think Casey Michel's case for why Russia might break up and what that would look like is, I think, very naive. Victor is saying my instinctive feelings toward the EU is positive, although I must confess I'm far too uninitiated even in it, even though I'm a citizen of it. So obviously I'm sitting here as a UK Remain voter who psychologically feels more European than British. I mean, I really think that Berlin is a city in my country and Paris is a city in my country. That's how I see Europe. But I am skeptical about the European Union's future. I think it's a declining institution that I see progressively weakening and progressively being in a dynamic where it starts sending signals that don't culminate. So it's not that there's going to be a collapse of the European Union. It's going to be a sort of a gradual melting off of it, whereby it starts becoming increasingly dysfunctional. That's unfortunately the trajectory over the next decade. It's one we should try to avoid. And standing up to Putin also is helped if we avoid that. But unfortunately, that's the trajectory as I see it, as great a Europhile as I am. Last question from Matthias. Is Chechnya only on paper still part of Russia? That's actually a really interesting question because we've been talking about what if bits of Russia wanted to secede. Paradoxically, one of the questions for the future of Chechnya might be, do you want to join Russia? Because it is in so many ways very independent. It's a country within a country. It's a country within which, to a good extent, the centralized monopoly of organized violence doesn't apply. So it's a very strange arrangement. And it's an arrangement that's going to be very heavily destabilized, potentially, by either Putin or Kadyrov disappearing. So we have to watch for that. It's going to be a challenge to the Putin regime if Kadyrov is gone, and it's certainly going to be a challenge to Kadyrov if Putin is gone. Um, and, the stories about Putin's health in the tabloids here in the UK and elsewhere tend to be false. But the stories about Kadyrov's health challenges recently are definitely not all false. So that is a factor, right, that rightly should lead us to anticipate regional destabilization there soon, potentially. It looks, as we are saying, is it really that Kadyrov has health issues? Is he being poisoned? He is having health issues. So let me express my gratitude to your beautiful community. We might not have timestamps this time round, but I think that's also kind of okay. I want to express my profound gratitude to you for being with me, and also your patience around my health when the delivery, especially on the main channel, is slow. So enormous gratitude. And it's also just important for anybody who still feels optimism about the world and about our politics to convey it and emanate it. And I do feel a reasonable degree of optimism about large features of our political and cultural life still. And so it's important that I shove that into the screen a little bit, because I know that a lot of people are not feeling it and don't know where to reach for some while not having any. Well, I've got some, and I'll keep turning up with it, even though I try not to make it kitsch and sentimental and overly positive. The kind of the nauseating optimism of Hollywood. Lots of love and gratitude for time with me, and bye bye till very, very soon.